Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Automate Network Configuration and Compliance Management with Itential. So my name is Chris Wade. I'm the CTO with Itential, and I have Idilise Baez with me, Senior Solutions Architect. Today's webinar will be split between a couple slides for context, and we have a significant amount of demos. So I appreciate everybody that took the poll results. We'll reference that in a little bit, but before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. Everybody's on mute. We're going to reserve Q&A till the end. There is a Q&A dialogue that you can input some questions. I would appreciate your questions for the end. And if we don't get to all the Q&A at the end, we'll send out an email with a summary of the questions and answers for everybody's reference. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So we have two parts to today's webinar. The first one is we're going to discuss our configuration management application and compliance and remediation capabilities. We're very proud of what we've done with that, and we're going to talk about some of the unique capabilities we have. The second part is really around how we integrate these configuration and compliance capabilities into an overall automation framework and an automation platform. You know, we do believe that a lot of these capabilities are becoming core standards in your automation efforts. So we want to talk about kind of how traditionally we've attacked these problems and how we think it's important that you integrate these capabilities into your end-to-end automation framework. So we're going to do kind of a part one, then we'll have a demo of that. Then I'll talk through a little bit more context for the end-to-end, and then we'll have a second demo that goes into how we integrate that into a device onboarding use case. So if we look at the traditional way we've attacked NCCM, and for those not familiar with that acronym, Network Configuration and Compliance Management, it was a reference that we used for a long time in the industry, and it was really centered around looking at CLIs, taking snapshots, taking rancid dumps, CLIing into box, and then we would basically take all of those configs and we would run a compliance report on it. So we created a whole bunch of templates that were the best practices and represented the golden configs for our network. We ran those reports and we would find anomalies. And then what we would do is we'd email those anomalies to other people. And those people, those network engineers or operations teams would try to remediate those issues locally. And then the next week or the next month, I'd run the reports and we'd send them back out. So we kind of had this post-haste fixing of network issues that were already existing in the network. So if we think about shifting that to kind of a modern view or the modern network, we want to integrate that config management practice into our day-to-day automations. So why don't we integrate a compliance report before I make a change in the network? Maybe the reconciliation process of modifying the network can be similar to different types of operational activities that we're already doing. So we're seeing a lot of reuse around how we talk to network elements. We're seeing a lot of overlap between use cases and modifications in the network. So it's really about the shift from kind of the traditional way we have solved these problems to how we've solved them in the modern network. And the last thing I wanted to say is that these requirements, even though NCCM has kind of maybe been less relevant in a lot of the discussions in the market, the needs of people managing the networks, these still exist. These have not changed. So we're really solving, you know, traditionally network configuration issues. We're just doing it in a modern way using modern tool chains and integrating it into the rest of your operational and network processes. So if we look at if we pulled a report and looked at the vendors that participated in the NCCM market over the last 10 to 15 years, this is the variety of vendors. You see Micro Focus, formerly known as HP&A, is probably one of the most widely known. If I look at the poll results, it looked like there was actually a large grouping that do not have these tools. So maybe a follow-up question later is whether people have removed these tools or whether they never had these tools in the first place. And then we kind of have a split between those Micro Focus, SolarWinds, and Infoblox. NetMRI is kind of the three existing traditional vendors that people said were in their network. So thanks for responding to the poll. So why do we even do NCCM? You know, there's obviously, we always talk about human errors in the network, and the purpose of network automation is to have machines driving the interfaces to our network infrastructure. So driving out that human errors accounts for obviously a large percentage of our issues. So anything we can do to integrate that config and compliance process into how we make changes in the network, so it's not separate, it's not out of band, it's not considered a manual overwrite, is critical to how we do that. And some other feedback we've received from the market and from customers is also that while NCCM is a critical component of managing our network, we need to integrate it into a larger network automation strategy. And if you've listened to previous webinars or read our collateral, we're big believers in the modern network moving from a CLI thought process to an API-driven process, whether you're adopting controllers or orchestrators or DevOps platforms. So as you start to adopt that type of infrastructure and tooling to solve other challenges, we wanted to drive these traditional config and compliance and remediation applications, leveraging those new tool chains, which is what we're going to show you today. So before I turn it over to Italise to go through the demo, sorry, the screen was just refreshing. So before I turn it over, there's some of these capabilities that you're going to see, and they're going to be similar to what you've seen in the past. But I did want to take just a minute and highlight why we've built this hierarchy into our templating engine. And basically, when we talked to customers of existing traditional NCCM tools, what they end up with is hundreds or thousands of templates. They reference golden configs for maybe a retail branch, maybe for a data center switch, but there's always exceptions. So this is our data center switch template, except if it's part of our Hadoop cluster or if it's in this data center in this region. We have all these exceptions. And what happens is a lot of times you have to balance how much abstraction you can put in those templates, and maybe you don't put the specificity you think would be beneficial to your compliance engines, but you can't necessarily manage, hundreds or thousands of individual templates. So we built this hierarchy into the golden config application so that you can basically build that logic into your hierarchy. So when we get into the demo, obviously we can still import certain pieces of config. We'll talk about variabilization and those types of concepts. But we wanted to give you the flexibility in how you build your hierarchy to map to the business logic of how you operate your network. So we want to bake all of those standards that you develop operating a network, and we want to be able to represent that within the software so that when you run reports, you don't think that there's exceptions, you don't think that we're overly agnostic. We want it to actually map to your business process so you can get the most out of this. The other part is that a lot of times we've talked about golden configs as a specific template, a point in time. And what we're seeing in the turning up of devices, both in the physical and virtual world, is that these processes are getting more complex. So instead of day 0, day 1, day 2, we're starting to see kind of day in processes where you might want to bring on devices, or you might want to migrate devices in phases, and you want different compliance at each of those phases. So as you turn them up, you can make sure that they are representing the configuration at that point in time. So the flexibility of the hierarchy and the flexibility of moving a device around allows you, we think, maps to your business process of turning up devices, managing your compliance, and actually representing all of the variation that exists and represents the standards of how you want to deploy a network, which obviously standards is one of the core capabilities of driving the adoption of network automation. So with that, we'll jump over to a live demo for the first demo, which focuses on config and compliance and remediation. So I'll turn it over to you, Elise.
Thanks, Chris. So I am sitting within Itential's Golden Configuration Manager, and as Chris mentioned, this application allows users to capture those device standards across your network and define and segment those device configuration standards based on those business needs. So whether that is based on device type and device role, or if it is a regionally based differences for your configuration, or the other example like day 0, day 1 through day n, just to name a few. Within my demonstration today, I'm going to be focused on a global data center configuration tree where I have segmented my configuration regionally. And I can quickly see a some high-level analytics around the tree compliance and the devices that are in or out of compliance, as well as the specific nodes throughout my tree. And I'm going to also point out that some of these top tree issues, as you continue to run your compliance and reports and gather these analytics, you might be able to start to gather some patterns around, say, a line that continues to pop up as an issue. Well, maybe that is a place for you to look at being able to change your standard because possibly something was actually incorrect with that particular line if all of your devices are constantly failing on that one piece of configuration. And we're also able to, with that parent-child hierarchy, to be able to add or remove these various child nodes that can then say, if I'm extending my data center and I want to be able to create that new standard for a different location, I can then create this new child node, and it is going to inherit all of the configuration from those parent nodes. So I don't have to go through and look at all of the configuration that I want to have through those other parent nodes. I'm automatically going to be inheriting it there just by adding in that child node. So moving down to the actual definition of the standard itself, we can see here some common lines of configuration that I've placed, and I'm able to leverage any existing networking skills by inputting that this standard native device configuration. And within each one of these lines of configuration that I've added, I have the flexibility to go in and say the level of compliance that particular line of configuration may is going to have on the device. So whether it's just an informational line, whether it's critical and it's going to be an error if a device does not contain these lines, or whether I also specifically don't want to see a piece of configuration on a device. I have the flexibility to make these definitions and define that standard quickly and easily within just a single node. And again, it will end up propagating as I make these changes to the other devices, not only in that node, but all of the child nodes that are beneath it. So Chris also mentioned this idea of, as the network has continued to be dynamic, it's really difficult and doesn't really make sense to attempt to be maintaining and managing your configuration in a static way. And so it's really important to also be able to integrate with, say, the ability to have regular expression and match patterns throughout your configuration, so that you're not statically defining certain numbers or maybe certain pieces of your configuration, as well as to be able to variabilize certain parts of your configuration. So if I wanted to say variabilize a particular host name or some versions, maybe some SNMP data or NTP server data, pieces of information that might change over time, as well as may also be housed in other external systems. So I want to be able to make sure that instead of having to update in multiple places, I'm able to create my standard in a way that will dynamically change as those other systems change as well. So with that, I'm going to now show adding a device to this particular node. And I have the ability to add groups of devices that I've defined, or I can search throughout my network for which devices I want to add. And I'd like to point out here that what Itential is doing is federating the devices across your entire network, regardless of whether it is physical or virtual. So you're able to create that standard in a multi-domain fashion without having to worry about who is orchestrating or controlling that particular device. So I've added a device here, and I'm going to now run a quick compliance report. And I'm going to navigate over to the history where I can see a detailed compliance report history of this particular device against this node. And within each one of these bars, I then can hover over and get a little bit more details around the number of lines of configuration that have errors or have passed, and I can drill into any one of these to get more information around which particular lines were specifically out of compliance for that device. So from here, I can manually go in and remediate a single line or multiple lines at a time and apply that configuration change. But what we also do is enable users to actually leverage each of the tasks that I've accomplished within this Golden Configuration Manager application via an API. So when I was adding a device to a node, or when I was running that compliance report or making these remediation changes, they're also all accessible via an API in order for you to leverage in larger end-to-end operational processes, as well as to integrate with those other network automations that you're trying to build out within your organization. And this is something that I'm going to show in more detail in my second demo. But before we get to that, Chris is going to talk a little bit more about that idea of incorporating these NCCM capabilities in your larger operational processes.
All right, thanks, Idalise. So before we jump into our particular view of the network applications that are in the ecosystem, just as an external reference, this comes from the Gartner Market Guide for Network Automation. This is talking about going from lowest maturity to highest maturity. So in previous webinars, we've talked about orchestration and policy-based and intent-based types of concepts, complementing that with network configuration and change management. Really provides kind of a holistic view, and I believe this reinforces the point that network automation has a number of applications that support the end-to-end lifecycle management of both devices and services. So when we look at how these map into the application domains that you'll hear from Itential, you'll hear about operations applications, configuration applications, which we're highlighting today. We've previously talked about orchestration and service lifecycle management, and also augmented that with policy. So when we view the overall Itential platform and what it provides, these configuration items and the demonstration you saw from Idalise for the first demo is very robust configuration capabilities. But we're going to talk about how we integrate this into the end-to-end automation concepts that we are constantly driving. So southbound of the platform is an ecosystem of lots of network technologies, and we traditionally talk about that as our adapter ecosystem. And northbound, you saw when she produced the Swagger documentation around our open API specification. As we bake in these automation capabilities, we see more and more customers driving those automations via API. And we want your users and yourself to execute and initiate those requests from the most appropriate place. So as we get into attaching these capabilities into end-to-end automations, we'll also show how we expose those through a self-service portal. We call it the automation catalog, where these will be executed and can be exposed with granular RBAC capabilities. We're really focused on the compliance and remediation capabilities being treated just like any other change in the network. We still want the same level of protections as we move from CLI to an API-driven ecosystem, and we still want the same capabilities around pre and post checks and the rest of the automation capabilities that people have come to benefit from when we start looking at integrating this into an end-to-end automation program. So with that, we'll do a little talking around demo 2 and then jump back into the demonstration.
Thanks. So within this second demo, I'm going to be leveraging that same tree and that device that I was starting to onboard within that Europe-based node, and I'm going to leverage it in a larger onboarding process that also integrates with your ITSM ticketing system, as well as that external resource inventory system I mentioned, where we were gathering those variables that we had within that standard that we defined. So the process is going to be to kick off that change request within that external ITSM system that you have, and then Itential will go through and automate the ability, or automate those kind of pre-device health checks. We will be able to have feedback loops in case of any errors, and as I said, then integrating from that external resource inventory system into that remediation and compliance automation, where then we can make sure that the device is completely 100% compliant on that node, before then in a phased process moving it from that Europe node down into a more granular location. So we'll then remove it from that node and move it down to London. So we're going to do a phased onboarding compliance demonstration here. So I'm going to flip over. And so we're going to start off in what Chris mentioned briefly is our automation catalog, which is that self-service portal where users, based on their roles and privileges and based on those RBAC capabilities, are able to see and execute or schedule network automations based on what they own within the network. And this is just a list of some operational day-to-day activities that have already been scheduled for their appropriate maintenance windows. And our global data center onboard can be found down here. And we will drill in and take a look at this particularly scheduled job. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to execute it manually, but I also want to note that you can take a look at, you can search for all of the automations that you have that you've created within this platform to be able to be scheduled and executed whenever is appropriate for your business needs. So with that, I'm going to kick it off, and we're going to follow along within our active jobs, where I am going to move over to a visual representation of this onboard process. So we've got a couple of colors of boxes here. The green boxes are the automated network intelligent tasks, and the blue boxes are places for manual interventions. And I mentioned before that we're going to start this particular process off by creating a change request within our ITSM system. In this particular case, it's ServiceNow, but it can be any ITSM system that you integrate the platform with. And we've just finished executing some pre-health maintenance checks. And what this entailed within Itential's platform was being able to execute device commands that were checking for any errors within the logs. And we have a command template that can then be reutilized and reused in other automations. So you don't have to copy and paste all of your device commands that into the CLI prior to your maintenance changes or prior to your network activities. Instead, you can go ahead and create that template, pair them with some evaluation rules, and then integrate them and automate those executions in your larger end-to-end operations. So you can see we evaluated the success or failure of those pre-checks, and we had the ability to take that out to pop out a fallout route to a manual operator if need be. And we've moved forward to a couple more pre-onboard tasks where we've created a backup for the device, and we have been storing that configuration in case of any sort of fallout that may have happened, or maybe an outage, where you can then go back and roll back to the previous configuration for this device. So you can see here an audit trail of each of these tasks as we go along are stored as well in case of needing to go back and check and see what changes were made and what executed against your network. So we also finished the gathering of those onboard variables that I mentioned before. So this task was reaching out to that external system to get the variables that we need in order to execute our remediation process. And we're now at our first child job. So this purple box in particular is a place where Itential is able to modularize your automation so that you can execute sub workflows And so you can then say, if you're going to constantly repeat, check the compliance and remediation on a node before you want to execute some configuration changes, instead you can have that be a sub workflow and make it part of a larger workflow like we're doing here. So drilling into that particular job, we've run that compliance against our Europe node, and we've done a loop through the devices of that node, and we're grading that report here. And so you can see we've looped through 2 different devices. So you've got iteration 1 and iteration 2. And then what we defined in this particular process was an evaluation for the success of this report, making sure that if it's not equal to 100, we would then go ahead and execute that auto remediation. So this has, once this has finished and kicked off and everything is completely compliant on that node, we then pushed on to our next health check, where again, we've executed some device commands to make sure that the health of the device is still good up and running. If not, we had another fallout path. And since all of that has gone through well, we are now on this next the next sub workflow, where we are removing that device from that Europe node and then moving it down the tree to have that more granular rules that are needed for, in this particular case, it was the London child node. And so this task is going to be completing, as you can see here, we've got that remove devices, then we added the device, and we are now going through that auto remediation. Now, I would like to point out, as this continues to run, that this was just this onboard process that we defined. We're doing it in phases, but again, that was just a business decision that we were looking at, because we wanted to make sure that as the device was being onboarded to our data center, that we were able to do it, day 1, day 2, day n. But it could, you could always just go straight down to that London node and run all of the remediation at once as well. We've now have successfully finished that second phase of our onboard process, and we completed some more post-compliance backups in order to capture another snapshot of the configuration for that device. And we're now sitting on our last manual task. So what we find with organizations as they are looking to continue to adopt automations for those network activities, that at first you might want to have more manual tasks for checks and balances and verifying, that the changes made to the network are what you're expecting. And as time goes on and you become more comfortable, you might start moving towards a more zero touch and remove those manual tasks unless you saw those error fallout paths. So we have this task that we're reaching out to an operator to ensure that the changes that have been made, the difference in that configuration for the device prior to our onboard process and at the end of our onboard process looks correct. And we can easily and quickly see here the added interfaces. We can see the changes to the access lists that have been made, and as well the changes to that SNMP and NTP server, where we pulled in those variables from that external resource. The option here is now to either say something went wrong and create an incident and roll back. So I mentioned, having those device, having the history of those configuration for the devices back up in order for rollback. So we have the ability to do that, or we can proceed as is. And I want to, again, highlight that this was just one example of leveraging that compliance and remediation, those compliance and remediation activities within a larger onboard process. As your organization either makes changes to your automations or as you continue to build new automations, Itential's automation platform allows you to leverage a wide array of network intelligent tasks that you can see here on the left-hand side, as well as any of those, any of the APIs that are that will be made available from the external systems that you integrate with. And you can make those changes by adding them to your canvas in this low code way. And from there, you're able to continue to expand on the current automations that you have and continue to easily update those business processes as they continue to change. With that, I'm going to pass it back.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so when we talk about configuration management, leveraging the Itential platform, we've talked a lot about some of these items. I did want to highlight the fact that we are federating devices from across your network, and we're doing it, that kind of bullet 2 and 3, we're doing it in a multi-domain, vendor agnostic way. So when we think about this, we've built these configuration and compliance concepts on top of our broad array of support of DevOps, controllers, and orchestrators. So as we consume and as people move from CLI to API, we'll continue to extend the platform to support the variety of configs that you're going to have within the network. And as what the network is today, a lot of times a physical device, as that becomes virtualized, and as we start looking at network concepts within the cloud, Itential will be able to support that broad array of multi-domain concepts. Whereas a lot of the tooling today was very centered around routers and switches and physical infrastructure. So we think that's critically important. And then when we talk about what are the core pillars of Itential, from a software perspective, these are 4 of the pillars we talk about on a regular basis. So connecting to everything, our broad array of adapters, both DevOps controllers and orchestrators, as well as your IT and enterprise ecosystem. The number of platforms to automate today is large and continuing to grow as your tooling and infrastructure continues to expand into kind of a multi-cloud world. Specifically within this platform, it contains a lot of network intelligence. So I was peeking at the Q&A. There's a question here on whether the platform is, whether we view network automation any different from, I believe the list was infrastructure automation, software automation, cloud automation. There's a lot of automation concepts around this. And most of the automation concepts are quite similar across automation domains, but the concept of network intelligence and having specific pre-built tasks and automations that understand the concepts of network. When we view the cloud, we think of compute, storage, and networking, and there's been a tremendous amount of effort as an industry in the compute and storage side. And there's also been a lot more standardization. We're seeing those same concepts come into the network as we go from CLI to API, and as we see more standards around the languages and data structures that we're seeing, whether it's Yang or Tosca, JSON schema, and others. So we've really built the platform around understanding those out of the box and that network intelligence that you can plug into your end-to-end automation concepts. And then repeating the multi-domain world, as we think, most people start to think about routers and switches. And peeking into the Q&A, there was also a question around, because we saw the demo around some, I think it was some iOS config. The question was how that expands to load balancers and network applications, but not necessarily network devices per se. So in that multi-domain world, we're going to be looking at compliance, and the demo today could be extended to show load balancers, firewalls, network devices, cloud applications, SD-WAN types of applications. So it's really about having that same concept and that same capability across your multi-domain world that you're going to be living in. And providing in a low-code environment, we want to expose these capabilities to the broadest set of participants in your enterprise, so that you can have as many of the people with knowledge of both the networks and applications participate in that end-to-end automation. This is not a specific domain with a very few people that can participate. So we want to expand the people that can participate in building up your automation and compliance capabilities. So with that, I'll jump into, I already stole 2 of the Q&A. I think I have 3 or 4 more I can pick from. So there was a specific question around the variables we used in the templates, if it's using YAML or Jinja 2. So when we're building those templates, we are grammar parsing the config that comes in, so we can do some additional validation. So we are not using Jinja in that specific capability, but we also have a templating engine, which we did not highlight in the demonstration today, which basically takes an object and performs a Jinja manipulation to it and spits out the network specific CLI that template supports. And in the inverse, just to complement that, we also have a text FSM parser. So if you're doing operational commands on the network, we can convert it back to an object, which can be manipulated in the workflow that Elise showed today. So we're not using Jinja 2 for that specific component within the application, but we do have Jinja 2 and text FSM and generic templating concepts for you to leverage as you build your automations. So we had that one, we had the automation. We had one around, I'm already using HPNA, can I leverage my existing templates? So those that have used HPNA, it's quite extensible. You could have done a lot of crazy stuff as far as inheritance and setting up of rules. But by and large, the way the CLI world worked and the way those compliance templates were created is they were based off of a lot of static CLI commands. So translating those over is quite straightforward. I believe that what you're going to do is you're going to move those over, and then you're going to have a whole host of rules and inheritance that we're going to have to manipulate within that tree for you to get the outcomes you want. So the benefit of moving in this would be to take, a lot of those templates and identify the inheritance between them, so that as Elise showed in the demo, we only want one set of commands or one set of configs to be in one component of the tree and drive the inheritance to the devices that should inherit that config. The key fact is that all the time we're wanting to change config for either security reasons or best practice reasons or rolling out a new network config. And if I need to change a security parameter on some routing protocol or on an interface, instead of me trying to find the hundreds of templates where that might exist, if I have created my inheritance in a strong way, then we can have the smallest numbers of changes impact the most number of devices. So we can make those changes with confidence and understand that we're not, it's using the business logic that we've built into the compliance system. And I think I answered this one about other device types, infrastructure. I think we got through the questions. I'll give you guys 30 more seconds if anybody wants to put in a question. But if not, we'll move to wrapping up the webinar. So I appreciate everybody's time. Appreciate the participation. Thank you for the questions. Hopefully this was useful, and we look forward to talking again. Thank you.